All right, so the postmodern ethnography, that's the chapter by Stephen A. Tyler in Writing Culture. And it's a very dense and complicated chapter. This is the chapter that sums up the whole book. This is like the culmination of postmodern thought in anthropology in the 1980s. And I think that it is easiest if I quote from the chapter, actually, because the quotes are very poignant. But let me start by saying that Tyler starts by saying that science is dead, basically. He explains why the positivist objective science doesn't have any place in anthropology anymore because it belongs to the common sense world. It's simple and uninteresting. Whereas the new thing now he calls evocation. And evocation is what should guide the ethnography, to evoke things. And this is where I'm going to quote. So what is a postmodern ethnography? A postmodern ethnography is a cooperatively evolved text consisting of fragments of discourse intended to evoke in the minds of both reader and writer an emergent fantasy of a possible world of common sense reality, and thus to provoke an aesthetic integration that will have therapeutic effect. It is, in a word, poetry, not in its textual form, but in its return to the original context and function of poetry, which, by means of its performative break with everyday speech, evoked memories of the ethos of the community and thereby provoked hearers to act ethically. Postmodern ethnography attempts to recreate textually this spiral of poetic and ritual performance. Like them, it defamiliarizes common sense reality in a bracketed context of performance, evokes a fantasy whole abducted from fragments, and then returns participants to the world of common sense, transformed, renewed, and sacralized. The way I read this is that what the postmodern ethnography does is that it takes us in, it invites us, it lifts us up to its level, and it shakes us around in its bellow among all those fragments. And then it spits us out again, out to the common sense world where we live. But when it has spat us out, we have gained something. We see the world differently. So that's a really good thing. And he says that the postmodern ethnography is polyphonic, so it has many voices. But at the same time, he's very critical to many of the previous ways that anthropology has been done. So he says that it's not enough simply to have a tape recorder, because in the case of a tape recorder, even if the aim is to include an oral performance or a dialogue in the text, it is also a way to, and I quote, exercise total control over her, the participants, over her discourse, and steal the only thing she has left, her voice. So in general, he's very critical throughout this text. He criticizes basically everything, but without really coming with much suggestions of his own, except for abstract thoughts, I would say. Anyway, the fragments, of course, are key to postmodern thought and also to his postmodern ethnography. A postmodern ethnography is fragmentary because it cannot be otherwise. We confirm in our ethnographies our consciousness of the fragmentary nature of the postmodern world. For nothing so well defines our world as the absence of a synthesizing allegory. See, this is the absence of the grand narrative that many postmodern scholars have written about. It aims not to foster the growth of knowledge, but to restructure experience. Not to understand objective reality, for that is already established by common sense. Nor to explain how we understand, for that is impossible, but to re-assimilate, to reintegrate the self in society and to restructure the conduct of everyday life. So again, this is the way I thought about being taken into the ethnography, being shaken around and coming out on the other side, reintegrated in society, having learned something or seeing it in a different way, having been filtered through something. And in that sense, again, the postmodern ethnography, or the ethnography at large, is poetry. An ethnography is a fantasy, but it is not a fiction. For the idea of fiction entails a locus of judgment outside the fiction, whereas an ethnography weaves a locus of judgment within itself. And that locus, that evocation of reality, is also a fantasy. It is not a reality fantasy like Dallas, nor a fantasy reality like the DSM-3. It is a reality fantasy of a fantasy reality. That is to say, it is realism, the evocation of a possible world of reality already known to us in fantasy. And as hard to grasp as this is, it is also so good and so, well, it's inspiring and uplifting. It's optimistic. I feel happy from it. Anyway, so what I thought about, as I mentioned throughout the reading, is that he doesn't really have any suggestions for, he doesn't come with any examples, for example. I mean, this book is full of analysis of ethnographic works and criticism, but not in this chapter. This chapter reads like a manifest, so it is very abstract. But one of the reasons for this is what he writes at the end of the chapter, where he includes his responses to the comments that he got from the other participants in the Santa Fe seminar, which is what resulted in this book. So what he says there is that no, there exists no postmodern ethnography. And I think that's really interesting because, of course, that is why he can't come with any examples. So he basically sketches out an ideal or a way of thinking, maybe. But I also think that, so I asked myself, does the postmodern ethnography exist today? I mean, we are, after all, 35 years after this book was published now, right? 35 years, yeah. And I think that to the extent that the postmodern ethnography exists, it doesn't exist within academia, because I think that many universities, despite their lip service to collaboration, reflexivity, the polyphonic, the multimodal, the multivocal, and all that, I think universities often want to be postmodern in the sense that Tyler describes, but I think that they often fail at it because they are stuck in their old ways. And a student who makes a truly postmodern ethnography according to these guidelines will get bad grades and will maybe not even be accepted by the universities, no matter how free they claim to be. And I was thinking, so what would a postmodern ethnography be today? Well, maybe this. This is Courttia Newland's book, A River Called Time. And I read this just a few months ago because it came out in January 2021. And of course, it's a novel. It's a very fragmented novel, and it's a wonderful novel. This is the postmodern ethnography. So I think that I can end this by saying that this chapter was so inspiring in all its craziness, and I want to read all the responses to it also, but I feel that I can almost stop reading the book now, because this chapter symbolizes the whole book and what they wanted to say, and it does so in very big words, very complicated words. I hated this guy for writing so complicated. It was so hard to get through it. But when you come out on the other side, it feels like you have walked through postmodern ethnography and been spat out on the other side. And that's a really good feeling. Yeah.